Hi, and welcome to ASD, the America's Youth Forum. I'm your host, Kathleen Lee. On today's show, our guest today is Mr. Alan Clayton. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Do you mind telling our viewers something about yourself and your current initiative?
Yes. I've been involved in redistricting, which is a very important effort to ensure that minority rights are protected in terms of how you draw legislative districts. And those determine resource allocation, many things that are important to all communities, but specifically to communities that have historically been underserved.
Let's go to our viewer questions. One viewer writes, while it looks like racist policies are being devised or uncovered, ignoring the sometimes ugly realities of unchecked immigration isn't going to resolve the issue or problem. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a very complex issue, and I think this year there was a good faith effort made by both Senator McCain, Republican, and Senator Kennedy, a Democrat, to come up with a comprehensive approach, which would deal with both the issues of border security and dealing with the 12 million individuals currently in the country. And what they wanted to do was look at both issues in the best sense of American justice and come up with a plan that's both humane but protects American jobs and also protects American economy. And I think what they came up with was something that will work, and it's through a political process. Unfortunately, the House of Representatives came up with a plan just basically for suppression, and a plan that just deals with the issues of let's make it tougher, but let's not look at a humane way to deal with this issue in the best traditions of the United States.
Now let's go on with George Powell with the ASD Think Tank.
Thank you, Kathleen, and welcome to ASD, the America's Youth Forum Think Tank segment of our show. I'm your host, George Powell. Today we'll be discussing three very important topics: illegal immigration issues, teen violence in our schools, and the Voting Rights Act. We're going to cut to a short break and be right back.
Well, the Voting Rights Act of 1964 was obviously a really important piece of legislation that guaranteed, millions of minorities the right to vote in areas they couldn't vote on before. Martin Luther King praised the act as a triumph of the conscience of man. If Congress allows these three measures to expire, people, not just in California, but across the United States, will lose rights that their grandfathers fought for. I just think that it's wrong, and I think that we should really renew these measures.
Welcome back to ASD, the America's Youth Forum Think Tank segment of our show. I'm your host, George Powell. The topic we'll be discussing today is the Voting Rights Act. Sheila, what are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts on the Voting Rights Act, I feel bad that it's going to affect people of minority and like immigrants and stuff, but I know that it will be expiring in 2007, and I just think that it's very important that all young people get together and start informing themselves or being aware of the things that are going on in the world, because it will affect all of us as a whole.
Kellen.
Why is the Voting Act set to be rescheduled in 2007? Why is it to be reissued? Why wasn't it more of a permanent fixture in the beginning, since it logistically makes sense?
So, why do you think the Voting Rights Act isn't permanent?
Well, the reason the Voting Rights Act is very, very strong. It basically says that the federal government can intrude upon states' rights. Why is that important? If you remember the states' rights issues, it was an issue of disenfranchisement of African Americans after the Civil War, taking away those rights to vote, to be part of the political process. This basically oversees many states and says, you know what, you cannot come in and take away rights. And that's why it is so fiercely fought by individuals that believe that the federal government should not be enforcing those civil rights. And that's why many of us believe that this is such an important part of the American dream that it has to be preserved and fought for.
Thank you. Now, we have come to the portion of our show that's called, What's Your Point? It's a chance for you to tell the audience and our fellow viewers, what's your point? What exactly you want us to know?
Well, I think the key thing is that democracy does not come without a watchful public. If you're not there when they do these major efforts, if the communities are not represented, if the civil rights groups are not watching, they can take away your rights. Reapportionment is about political power, and who wins determines who controls Congress. Right now, many of the policies you see coming out of Congress are determined by a very close number of congressional members. And that can change in terms of the war, in terms of economic justice, the environment, on how many members are elected. And that's all about reapportionment. And all you have to do is look at Texas, where 6 Republicans were elected, where there were 6 Democrats. That may shift how we deal with justice issues in America for minorities. It shifts everything. So it's so critical. We have to watch it because that's the way to preserve the American dream.
Hold that thought. We'll be back for more on ASD, the America's Youth Forum. Welcome back to ASD, the America's Youth Forum. I'm your host, Kathleen. Again, we have our guest, Mr. Alan Clayton, Director of the EEO of the Los Angeles County Chicano Employees Association. Let's begin with our audience Q&A. Our first question from the audience.
My name is Nicole Taylor, and I'm from Village Christian Schools, and I'm 15. Mr. Clayton, are you familiar with the 1960s-70s struggle of Latinos and other non-black racialized minorities to have the Voting Rights Acts extended to their respective communities defined in the Act as language minorities?
Yes, I am.
How important is it?
Well, if you want to secure the American dream for all people, you have to have an act that covers both African Americans and also language minorities, because discrimination in the South was against the African American community, but there's also discrimination in the Southwest against the Latino communities. Clearly in the states of Colorado, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, there was discrimination, and many times it was very tough to get people elected because of the massive discrimination. And there was evidence put forth by Latino organizations, the GI Forum, LULAC were 2 of the groups involved, to tell the government, the Congress, that you need to also remedy that discrimination that's occurring in the Southwest and also in the Northeast against other minorities. And because of that, the 75 Act was passed, which basically amended the Voting Rights Act to include language minorities. And what it did over the years was increase the enforcement dealing with all minorities so that you could file suits or the Justice Department could get involved to change the practices that kept minorities out of the political process. In 1982, the Act was amended, and the Act was amended because the Supreme Court had come down with a very tough decision that made it very tough to prove discrimination. The 82 Act said you don't have to prove discrimination, you have to show impact. What that means is if you took away a district from an African American community or a Latino community, you could show impact, you could win in court. But it also means that if there was a community out there and they lived in a particular area and you didn't draw the district, then that community could sue you. And over the years, African Americans increased, Latinos and Asians, to the numbers they are today in states like California, where if you look at the assembly, you'll see there's significant numbers of both African Americans, Asians, and Latinos. And if you look at the South 30 years ago and look at today, you'll see African Americans have significant numbers in Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, and Texas.